the Africa Climate Summit 2023. It's going to be held in Nairobi at the KICC. Various conversations taking place. Kenya is taking the front row and a leading position on the Africa climate talks. The CEO of that summit is in the studio now with us, Joseph Nganga. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome to the hot seat, the Situation Room. Karibu sana.
Asante.
City has the day's proverb. Every week he gives us a proverbs from one country. This week the proverbs are from Burkina Faso, which has a military ruler and a president who's been ousted.
Yes. Blaise
Compaoré.
Yes. That's the gentleman.
That's the man, eh?
Yes. In that region, if you're talking about West Africa and you're talking about the Sahel region, it's called a coup belt. It's like the thing that predominates the conversation there is a coup followed by another coup followed by a counter coup. It's hard work keeping up, but the proverbs remain the same.
We haven't had a coup in a while.
Where?
Captain so-and-so. Do something.
Come on. Shake things up just a little bit.
Next door, these guys are at it. We're being left behind. Come on, man. Anyway, and now it's gone a notch further. Nigeria is telling people, excuse me, get out of our business. You, first of all, you Nigeria, you.
You echo us.
You're telling us what to do.
Who are you?
We are going to come there and we know who was elected and who is in power right now.
We know who should have been
We'll
elected.
set it right for you.
We'll come and install democracy.
Keep joking with us. Right. Today's proverb. Ants, as in siafo. Okay? See auntie. Ants surround the dying elephant.
Ants surround the dying elephant.
Yes.
Joseph, this proverb, when you hear it, what's your interpretation of it?
Ants are very intelligent. They can see when dinner is about to be served.
Hungry.
Can spot it from far.
Exactly.
So what do you think the Burkinabe are saying? Be like the ant?
Well, I'm not sure what they're trying to say, but if I were to think on my feet, which is not my strength, I would say it's about anticipating opportunities and challenges, and ants have an ability and a knack to do that. And despite their small size, when an elephant is weak and it's its worst, the most little of animals can overcome it.
Good perspectives. Good perspectives.
No, it's actually very good. In fact, there's this picture in my mind when you go to these channels that deal with animals and how they go about their political affairs. You actually see how all these animals, when some creature has died, over time, you see the creature, then slowly it just disappears until there is nothing. And ants are part of that particular political system. Yes.
Yep. Joseph, you're part of a group of professionals that people don't interact with on a daily basis, the public, the wider public. When the president hosted you at State House and announced you as the CEO of the Africa Climate Summit, some people were seeing you for the first time. Some people will see you next month for the first time and will be like, okay, so we've got a Kenyan who was hosting this. Who is he? So why don't you just introduce us to Joseph Nganga?
Well, how much time do you have?
Wow.
A lot of time.
As we have time, a whole hour.
No, I would say I am obviously a Kenyan, born and raised in Thika. I've spent most of my life working in entrepreneurship. So setting up companies, building new organizations across different sectors, and in the last 15 years in the renewable energy sector. But renewable energy and climate are very closely linked. And so I would say climate, which is an emerging agenda for all of us, is part of what I've spent 15 years doing. I also have 2 wonderful children. And yeah, that is Joseph.
360 view an introduction into Joseph.
No.
There's that's what 270.
No, that's too, no.
You want some 90 more?
That's he said 360. No, it's 180.
It's 180.
Yes.
There's the other side.
Children, you then.
I have parents too.
Okay. I've got you.
You got it.
I've got it.
360 now?
That's 720.
Okay. So you said the last 15 years you've spent time in the renewable energy space, and you're seeing the correlation between that and climate and the climate change. Now you will be leading Kenya's preparation and organization of the Africa Climate Summit. What is the Africa Climate Summit?
Thank you. And just to be very clear, I am not leading. This is His Excellency's vision. He is leading the world in a new conversation around climate. And I am what we call KYM. I'm here to make sure that the machinery works so that he has a platform in which to engage the world in this new narrative.
Okay.
And it's a really exciting summit. It's a first summit that Africans are coming together, gathering to agree on a common position to engage the world from a climate action perspective. It's also really exciting because the attendance is over 25 African presidents, global leaders, leaders of philanthropy, leaders of civil society, private sector, and so on. So we anticipate that the conversation would not be people speaking to themselves, but rather the global community engaging to address an existential crisis that we are all facing, which is climate change. And we'll be doing so on the continent, and it's hosted in Nairobi by His Excellency in his capacity as the chair of African Heads of State and Government on climate change at the AU. So it's an AU summit hosted by His Excellency in Kenya.
Why is it important this time? Why are we hosting it for the first time?
I think there's a recognition that as a continent, we can no longer be seen as victims. We can no longer be seen as helpless. We must be seen as part of the solution. And we do have the solutions. As His Excellency says, we have across the continent all the tools, all the instruments that can help unlock the climate crisis. But to do so, we need to discuss the whole climate finance architecture. The current situation with financing makes it impossible for us to unlock those opportunities and deliver solutions to the world. And so we need to figure out as a collective how we address the climate finance part, so what we already have, which are the resources, can then be optimized.
There are many conversations around climate, around renewable energy, some say to be clashing. So we are looking at world geography, and those have always bumped heads in terms of what ought to be done. I think it's very interesting that a conversation now is being steered from an African point of view, and that those who are in positions of leadership then can now take charge and be the conversation starters and continuers of this. But the question is now, will it be looking at these conversations that are being had from an African perspective in terms of what African nations must do and not what they've been told to do over the last 20 years?
It's a very good question. And the reason I feel it's an important question is because it's also about perspectives. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to say, actually, I understand what the challenge is as an African leader. I know what I can contribute, and these are the things I need from my colleagues globally to be able to make my contribution. And I think by having this conversation in Africa, led by African governments, ensures that that is what is coming across. You will see throughout the summit, and I hope you're attending, you will see throughout the summit.
We need to be invited.
No, it's open registration. We are already at 21,000 registrants.
Okay,
please join.
We need to be invited.
And we are closing down the registration tomorrow at noon. So if you're going to register, please do so.
No, I didn't hear me.
He's invited you.
Please go on.
His Excellency has invited the world. I believe that includes you. So from that perspective, it's Africans saying, yes, others have polluted in the past. They must help address the challenges we are facing because we didn't cause that pollution, and therefore the impacts on climate must be compensated by those who have done the pollution. But that is not enough, because going forward, unless we work collectively, even with the expected compensation in terms of loss and damage, in terms of the $100 billion committed annually, in terms of the 0.7% of development finance being committed, it's hardly enough. It gets us a few $100 billion. But what we need are over $3 trillion annually from 2030 to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So yes, let's have those who have polluted, compensate those who are suffering the worst of it. But in addition to that, let us work collectively to unlock what is needed, which is a substantially larger amount of resources.
Sure. There's also the conversation about the development of African nations and how that plays vis-a-vis the need to protect the environment and to mitigate the dangers of climate change. Where does this all fall? Because largely those countries rest and are domiciled in Africa.
Yes.
There's the need for development. There's also the need to protect the environment. Where will this conversation play here?
Clearly, you've done your homework. It's very, very important that we address the development part of our continent. We have, for example, over 600 million Africans who don't have access to electricity. We have education needs. We have infrastructure needs. We are the youngest continent in the world. Those young people need jobs. The development agenda is crucial. And we are very excited because as part of the summit, we will have discussions around that. The MDB reform, the DFIs and their reforms, the global financial architecture and their reforms are crucial to ensuring that we are providing the right kind of development finance to unlock development opportunities on the continent. When countries are at the precipice of debt default, have challenges with liquidity, it's impossible for them to also prioritize climate investments. So first and foremost, we must prioritize the right kind of development finance. So the conversation at the Africa Climate Summit will include conversations around development and the right type of development finance. We can no longer continue having the kind of credit ratings that makes it impossible for countries on the continent to borrow money to advance their development agenda. But what we're also saying is that climate and climate investment is not in contradiction to development. It is in addition to. So let's do all the right things to fix the development agenda, but then let's also build onto that the climate agenda.
When we say, because you've touched on something that the president has also talked about, even globally, we need to review the global financial architecture. Do we have proposals on the table?
Absolutely.
Is there a specific agenda that will be discussed at this summit, which we hope that at the end of the summit there'll be a communique and a resolution being adopted by African countries? This is what we are telling the world going forward. We start engaging on this particular front.
Absolutely. So one of the outcomes of the Africa Climate Summit is the Africa Declaration, or rather the Nairobi Declaration. And within that declaration, we talk about those points where we say what needs to happen, what is the right conversation around the financial architecture that must be implemented going forward. And I think His Excellency has taken a very bold position in engaging the world by defining the challenges and then offering solutions. But those solutions must be addressed and implemented on a global stage. They are not exclusive to Kenya or to Africa. They are global conversations. What do I mean by that? If you look at his narrative on the global financial architecture, and as I said earlier, let's please continue with this development conversation. Let's make sure we are reforming the MDBs. Let's make sure we are following the Bridgetown Initiative and other initiatives around that. But that won't get us the quantum of money needed to address climate challenges. And to bring it closer to home, if you look at a country like Malawi, they have over $1 billion worth of infrastructure damage in the last 2 years because of cyclones.
Yep.
Now, Malawi today has a hard time borrowing money to invest in the country's development agenda, let alone address the climate damage, because it's considered from a credit rating perspective, from a liquidity, from a debt perspective, as a difficult to invest in country. And so what His Excellency is saying is we must look at the climate agenda very differently. We must collect global revenues that are independent of political interests. Today, revenues are collected from developing world based on their commitments, based on what they want to provide, based on political interest. If the politics of a particular country like the US changes, their development finance, their climate finance changes. So His Excellency is proposing, and that's part of the declaration, is that we have global revenues that are independent of regional or country politics. But then the governance is also crucial to that money. So if we collect all that money, but the decisions are made by those who have the ability to contribute the most, they will drive their agenda.
Yep.
So the governance of that money must be driven by climate first. And then the priority on investment also needs to be very clearly around climate and not around regional interest. Kenya has a much stronger position in terms of its ability to borrow vis-a-vis Burundi, for example. So we must not have Kenya borrowing based on what Kenya wants to do. For this pot of money, that must be driven by where do we get the highest climate impact for those global revenues. And so we expect that as part of the declaration. We have drafted the declaration based on His Excellency's vision. That is now sitting with the AU as an AU declaration. AU is sharing it with all member states, gathering their inputs. And I'm very, very excited and feel very strongly that they will endorse the declaration because it speaks to us as a collective, as Africans.
It's been said previously that it's easy for African nations to come together because our problems are more or less similar. So similar problems, easy to come together in concert. Would this be another position whereby looking at the problems, look at bans, for example, that have taken place that would then protect the environment in one way or another on the African continent? The problem of implementation comes into play. Okay, what happens after that? You could replicate it across the continent. Doesn't matter where you look, really, and you'll find those issues. When you look at financing, again, another problem. Through and through. Is this an opportunity for Africa to have a united front when it comes to some of these matters and say, well, look, let us deal with our issues as Africa? Because I think there's a lot that needs to be done. We can point fingers at the global north for a lot. And in some cases, it's necessary to do because they're at fault. In other cases, no, because we have a lot of work to do. Is this an opportunity to then have we as African nations united on a front in terms of what needs to happen administratively, governmentally, at the same time saying this is the position that we have taken for world conversations then on climate?
Absolutely. And you've hit the nail on the head, which is we as Africans have a common and must have a common position. And this is part of what we hope to have as an outcome of the summit. Why? Because we face a lot of similar challenges across the development agenda. Some countries have bigger problems on one item or another, but collectively we have very similar challenges. Where we also are incredibly complementary is in our resources. For example, South Africa, with its current energy mix, stands to suffer a lot from an economic perspective because as we price carbon, and South Africa is heavily electrified with coal, their economy would be at risk. It's already at risk. They have huge unemployment among young people. But Mozambique and DRC can solve South Africa's problem because they have large rivers that can provide hydropower that can decarbonize South Africa's electricity system. But not only decarbonize it, but offer competitive electricity and in the process also help DRC and Mozambique develop. And so we have similar challenges, but we are also incredibly complementary in our resources. And so having that collective conversation, unlocking our strengths as from a regional perspective is part of what I believe this summit will and aims to achieve, which is, yes, we have common challenges, but if we bring our strengths to the table, we unlock our collective challenges.
And we can also have common solutions. Let's take a break. It's 8:30. Kenya's biggest conversation is hosting Joseph Nganga. He is the CEO of the Africa Climate Summit. Kenya will be hosting African leaders for the first time to come together and have an African conversation about climate and the effects of climate change. This will be taking place next month in Nairobi. Registration closes tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, how does one register as we take this break?
Yes, so the website is acs.org, and you can register there between today and tomorrow. We close at noon tomorrow. We're already at 21,000 registrants, but